welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm so pleased to be here.
And your background training, you're a physiotherapist, am I right? Is that how it got started?
Yeah, so my first degree was physiotherapy, and then I started working very early on in a mental health hospital. We didn't really learn a lot at that time, sort of over 20 years ago in our training about the mind. We learned lots about the body and how injuries affect you in physical rehab. But I just saw first and foremost the people who were struggling at their lowest point, just the power that exercise can have when they're so unwell they're in hospital. And I was kind of hooked from then, really.
What did you see? Like, do you have a case study, or was there one particular moment in time or a person that made you really get it?
Um, I'd say it was more of a whole ward ethos, more of a whole ward ethos. So I was working on this particular unit where it was, very different then from what it is now. There wasn't much of a focus on looking after people's body in mental health hospitals, and there wasn't much of an emphasis on actually application of exercise. So I sort of came in as a sort of an energetic, newly qualified physiotherapist, and just with an idea of, let's say, get everybody up and moving, and we set up some sort of exercise groups and walking groups, and just sort of seeing the whole shift of the whole ward of these people that had been in hospital for quite a period of time and quite unwell and didn't want to engage in many other activities. It just sort of really sort of shifted amongst this sort of really eclectic mix of people who were struggling with their mental health in lots of different ways. And I just thought, this is really powerful. And the stories that the patients would tell me is they would often sort of struggle to sort of sit down with a psychologist or their medical doctor or psychiatrist and tell them how they were feeling. And here I was going in a group or on an individual basis, and they would really open up to me because I wasn't going in and asking how they were feeling and, all those questions. There's just a natural sort of conduit to sort of open. And I just thought this is a really powerful tool.
You've been researching this for decades now. Could you just talk a little bit on a top line for what is going on with that connection between movement and the mood? Like, we know if we go for a walk, we're going to feel better at the end of it. But what is actually physically happening?
So the short answer is lots. And the longer answer, the longer answer is we're still learning. But maybe your sort of listeners or your everyone that engages with you will have heard of things such as the runner's high, or perhaps some people have heard about endorphins and endorphin rush. And it was a long held belief that, why we feel good when we engage in movement, exercise, go for a walk is because of this runner's high, this endorphin rush. And so we and others have demonstrated that, yes, when you engage in exercise, you do have a release of endorphins, but they actually have difficulty crossing what we know as sort of the blood-brain barrier to exert their effect. So we don't think it's much to do with endorphins. We think it's much more to do with a whole array, a multi-system and effect of different other factors. So, for instance, we know that when you exercise, we've shown that a substance called BDNF is released, or brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And this really is like a brain fertilizer, and this gets released and helps sort of cognition and new nerve cells both grow and synapses between them grow and develop. So it's like, just fertilizer all over your brain and your central nervous system. There's also areas within your brain which we have shown that you can change the volume, because the brain is a living structure which is continuing to change and process new information and respond to the demands placed upon it. So if we look at people with depression, anxiety, stress, even dementia, we see, for instance, one of the key areas of the brain which is reduced is this area of the brain called the hippocampus. And this is a key emotional processing area, and it's also really important for the consolidation of long-term memory from short-term memories. It's a key target for many mental health treatments. And we've shown that over like an 8-week period with regular running, you can increase the volume of this vital area within the brain. And then also we've shown in shorter bouts you can do this. And, I've just touched upon a couple of areas, but there's many other neurobiological factors that are going on. And we just essentially think we don't know the full amount. There's many systems which are going into it. We're still understanding it, but there's also many other sort of psychosocial mechanisms going in too. So you go out and do bit of exercise, a run, a walk, a yoga class, you feel a sense of achievement. You may meet with some friends, you feel a sense of connection. So there's basically lots going on, and we're just starting to really piece it all together.
You mentioned dementia, and of course, everyone is terrified of dementia, and the rates are set to explode in this region, particularly. So, do you suspect that there's some link between movement, mental health, and dementia? Because when you talk about that fertilization of the brain, that's just a beautiful phrase to describe. So, could you talk a little bit about that relationship?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Um, we know that, dementia levels are increasing internationally. Some of that may be as a result of people having more access to, to sort of treatment and services that can recognize that. But regardless, as we know that levels are increasing, and we know that dementia is not an inevitability, but the changes that are put in place happen many years before the signs of, the most common symptom is sort of difficulties with memory and planning. Those signs and symptoms happen, so the underlying factors happen years, if not decades before then. So there's a real critical run-up period for people. And it's recognized that physical activity and movement is one of the key modifiable risk factors that can be influenced the sort of longevity and the health of the brain and reduce the risk of dementia. And then probably when it gets to people who have more advancing cognitive impairment, so if you start to do tests on people's cognitive function, then it's much more difficult to reverse those changes. So prevention, as with most things, is much more key, and it has a really key role across the lifespan. And the time for all of us is to start today, and not wait until we start to sort of get a bit forgetful, for instance.
Well, it's one of those beautiful things where the benefits are immediate and also long term. And it's so interesting because there's no one answer, but everyone wants the one answer. Everyone wants the magic pill. But this is probably the closest thing as there is to a magic pill for mood and also dementia. If you were to pick one thing, movement might be it. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly implicated in every system and function within the brain, particularly when we're talking about mental health and cognitive factors. There's lots of evidence we've done and others looking at the role of movement on the prevention of mental health conditions, the protection of better brain health and cognition. So absolutely.
When we're looking at all of the research into movement, it seems like, what is there a top line about a kind of exercise? Because I've been around since, the cardio stairmaster 90s, and now it's all about weightlifting. Hours, an hour of HIIT was in there. Some people say yoga. Like, is there a guideline to what kind of movement?
No, so I think what we on a sort of top level is there's been a very big focus, as you said, on the importance of aerobic training, where we focus on getting our heart rate up and our lungs working. Really important. There's really good evidence for higher levels of intensity. Before I talk about type, and also maintaining cardiorespiratory fitness, that's pretty strong evidence for lots of factors, including cognitive and mental health in the future. But more broadly, is there's much stronger evidence, as reflected in guidelines, about the role of strength training too, and it's important to have some strength training in, regardless of how much cardio you're also doing. So we've done lots of work looking at how strong people's muscles are and the risk of cognitive decline in the future, and showing that people who have consistently stronger muscles are also less likely to develop mental and cognitive health in the future. We did a big study in the UK. Looking at the future risk of depression and anxiety in people's cardiorespiratory fitness and also their strength. And we found that both higher levels predict, protective against mental health conditions in the future, observationally. But, if you want the best protection, combine both of them together. So that's talking about that, but without going into what type is it. Should it be yoga? Should it be Pilates? Should it be squash? Should it be running? Should it be paddle? The research just shows benefits for virtually all of these, and it's less about the type. It's much more about having the sort of dose, in terms of doing something regular, having a sufficient intensity, doing it for enough amount of time, and that is much more important, it appears, than the type, beyond having some aerobic and resistance training in there. And sort of from a behavioral science perspective, beyond that, it's much more important for each person to find something that they enjoy and they find challenging and interesting. And also if it has a social element, because you're much more likely to do it next week, next month, and in the future. Rather than go with the sort of latest fad or something else. I don't know, go and do some crazy new fad and you can only do it for 4 weeks and you sort of give up. Just find something you enjoy and keep doing it.
Okay, so one trend I've noticed, I became obsessed with fascia like 20 years ago when I was a journalist in Canada. And I've noticed like an explosion in sort of workouts that are looking at the fascia and this connective tissue in the body. Have you looked at any of those, any of your work looking at fascia, or is that involved in this movement, mental health connection?
No, I haven't looked at any of the sort of role of fascia. I spent lots of time looking at sort of fascia and connective tissue as a physiotherapist and working with people, but not on a sort of research level. And I don't think there's any strong evidence to talk about the sort of role of fascia in the onset of mental or cognitive health issues.
Okay. I'm interested in your take on the average person reading a newspaper article about the latest fitness craze. There's always a study that comes out that says you should be doing this or you should be doing that. How would you tell people to sort of, you do this research. So what drives you nuts when you see the media reporting, and how should people be sort of careful when they're deciding what to do?
I think fortunately, the exercise is a bit clearer than other areas that are really messy, such as nutrition. And I won't sort of get into that, where it's very, very sort of conflicting and there's no consensus in that. So exercise is relatively simple. And I'd say, if anything, the exercise research industry, and importantly, the translation of that, if anything, overcomplicates it. It really doesn't need to be complicated in terms of having the health benefits for the average person. I'm not talking about your competitors, your elite athletes, people who are training for, major events. But for most of us, it's about finding a movement you enjoy. You're much more likely to go and do it in the future. Don't absolutely hammer yourself in terms of intensity or time, because not only will you put yourself at risk of injury, but also it'll be more difficult to go back, back to. Not everybody likes hammering it all of the time. And just consistency in terms of regular going and attending is much more important than racing for sort of times or pace or anything else. And just, focus on getting your heart and lungs working up, 3 times a week for, 10, 15 minutes plus. Ideally, the more the better. But I'm aware that most people are not even doing that. And then focus on introducing strength training once or twice a week and build up from there. Don't go too fast, too quickly, because people get despondent, get injuries, get aches, and don't go up. This is something that we want to do for the long term. So it doesn't need to be any more complicated than that. I've probably made it much more complicated than it should be. And if I was saying what personally makes me a bit sort of annoyed, not annoyed is a bit strong, but what do I sort of see from the literature is there's a lot of repetitive research which is reported in the media, and often poor research gets quoted as a headline. And unless you're really sort of trained in research methods, which is quite boring, so most people are not, then people get lost in a message, and authors, researchers are naturally encouraged to come up with sensationalistic headlines, and often the research doesn't match that. So sensationalist headlines and repetitive research where we know the answer drives me personally a bit nuts.
Okay. Now, what about the flip side, exercise addiction? Because we hear more and more, and especially for women, that there can be too much exercise. You can be putting too much stress on your body. And ironically, it's often the link between movement and mental health, right? People are sort of seeking that benefit that they get from mental health from the workout, plus the physical benefit. But has your research looked at any of this when you're over exercising? How much is too much?
Absolutely. So I had a PhD student do a whole PhD on this particular topic, on the whole role of exercise addiction in the absence of eating disorders. I'll talk about eating disorders first, because that's an area where it's, sort of commonly sort of accepted. So we know that eating disorders, and again, there's various clusters such as anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, and a few others, that for a lot of people within that cluster, exercise addiction, as is alteration and an over focus on what you're eating, to an obsessional viewpoint where it's harming your health, is a key factor. And I'm not going to go too much into eating disorders unless you want to, but we recognize it's a core part of that for most people, is you're continuing to exercise when it is really detrimental to your health, and sometimes very, very, can be very, very, very serious. And I've worked in a national eating disorders unit, so I know what it's like on the ground floor. So if we look at exercise addiction outside of a diagnosed eating disorder, it's really interesting because there's no common consensus yet, although we're working on it, of what is exercise addiction. And my PhD student, Mike Trott, looked at this particular question, everything that had ever been published, and lots of people have tried to sort of quantify this. And really, what is an exercise addiction? So exercise addiction is really an over focus and a sort of compulsion that I must exercise, where it interferes with my, functioning in daily life, or, I feel really guilty if I don't exercise, to the point where, a person may do things such as continuing to train when injured, or just feeling like they absolutely have to train and becoming quite distressed when they're not able to sort of train. And we think that around 20% of people who are using sort of regular gyms and other facilities may have this exercise addiction. And I'm sure if you've been into any sort of gyms or other facilities, if you go in the morning, sometimes you see this particular person or group of people. If you go at lunch, you see the same people, or if you go in the evening, they'll often be there. And really, for those sort of people, if I'm assuming that they do have this, often something is going on a much sort of deeper level for people, because we can continue to say there are benefits for exercise, up to about 300 minutes per week, which sounds like a lot, but it's not a lot if you're training for an event, unless you're training for an event. So beyond that, we can't justify continued health benefits, physical or mental health. So people who are going beyond that, it's really excessive unless you're training for an event. So I'd sort of encourage people not really to go over that, and really, people that do have this, it's just about sort of, I've worked with people in this particular area, is understanding what is the particular factor that they're trying to go towards. So I've worked with some people where it's been a real focus on sort of body image, for instance, or there has been a particular traumatic event in their life, or there's been a difficult event that could be a relationship split up, that could be something even more sort of really unpleasant in the background. And exercise has initially been a really useful outlet to help that person deal with this particular issue, but then it's developed at some point in a strange way into an inadvertent coping strategy, which is now actually becoming quite problematic and difficult for that person to stop.
Okay, that's very interesting. That's everyone who's ever gone to a gym has seen this. And, I've even experienced it myself. When I became injured, I injured my shoulders, and I remember thinking, I'm not going to be able to make it if I can't work out. And then I thought, no, you've got the breathing, you've got the, you're going to be able to do it, but it is addictive. So it's interesting, even if you're not actually addicted, you might feel that you're addicted. And that's like a little mini addiction, if I'm making any sense.
Yeah. Absolutely.
What is the right amount of time to just lift your mood to exercise?
So, we did an interesting study sort of with ASICS, actually, where we looked at people's mental health before and after a bout of exercise. We wanted to understand this question, and we developed this tool where we did some facial scanning with people to try and get an objective measure of mental health before and after, based on some EEG experiments, and then we sort of translated it into this particular tool. And we found that for the average person, and again, I'm not talking about the competitors, I'm not talking about the people who are always in the gym, but the average person, 15 minutes and 9 seconds was the amount which was there for people to have meaningful uplift in their mood. But generally, sort of speaking, outside of that, is we continue to see mental health benefits from relatively low levels, 15 to 20 minutes beyond that study, up to 150 to sort of 300 minutes per week.
And have you done any looking at this region in your research? And if so, can you just sort of speak about it?
No, sorry, I haven't done any in the region, but very, very much like to change that.
What does it look like from the outside? Are we fit? Are we not fit? You were just here, so.
Well, I've only been there for a few days, so I wouldn't want to have any particular viewpoint on that, particularly in the absence of data.
Okay. And my last question is, what continues to surprise you when you do this research? Or what surprises you when you
So again, these things surprise me, but they surprise me with data and they surprise me with my own experience. The power of exercise on mental health and how good it makes us feel immediately after. On my own level, even though I spent all my time researching this and then I go and do a run or go and do a workout, I'm not thinking, God, this is good. And so like on an individual level, that really surprises me. And then also when we do research and we find this, I'm like, geez, this is really powerful and beneficial for people. And also when I see people's experience, when I sort of lead groups or doing research with people, so it continues, the obvious thing continues to surprise me. And I'm really interested, on another angle is, sort of like it's quite cruel sort of conundrum, really, if we're struggling with our mental health. So we know that movement is good for our mental health, but, if we're not feeling very good in our mental health, it's often difficult to get going. And that's probably when we most need it. And that sort of cycle of how to break out of when we're not feeling particularly good, and how do we sort of get people out of that? It's very, sort of clear to me how to sort of do that on a personal level. And I've done it with lots of people to help them get out of that. But how to sort of do that and communicate that at scale is something that I'd really like to sort of, do much, much more of as well.
Okay, and how do you do it?
Be really kind to myself if I'm not feeling great and I'm feeling stressed, anxious, low. Be really kind to myself, and I will, because my mind will tell me, don't go for a run or for a workout. You've not got time, and my mind will delay. So I'll put tasks in place. So I think I'll go later, and then I'll like have breakfast, and then I'll think, oh, I can't go for a few hours because I've got to digest breakfast. And then it'll be lunch and I'll be, oh, I'm a bit tired. I'll have lunch and then I'm full. And then just go. And then I'm in the evening. So I recognize patterns within me as I've got this like delay sort of tactic where I put it off within myself. So I have to sort of break those within me and just sort of say, because I'm expecting that I need to go, even with the knowledge I have, I need to go for an hour or more, but I don't. But I know that that's not the case. So what I will do is I will just, I will find a time when there is a window and I just think I'm going to go for 15 minutes or 20 minutes. I'm going to go for light. I'm not going to go hard and fast. I'm not going to be obsessed by what my watch is telling me or anything else. I'm just going to go and just enjoy the movement. And then when I'm out and I've started, then I can really start to enjoy it. So that's what I tend to do.
Okay, and usually you end up staying longer. Like usually, do you find that you end up working out longer? Yeah.
I do. And then when I've had that experience, I'm building up a memory that I don't need to go out and be really hard on myself.
Okay. Well, that's wonderful. It's wonderful to hear you with all your work still struggles like the rest of us. It's not wonderful. I didn't mean that. I meant like, we're all human and it's not easy for anyone. Yeah. Oh, thank you so much. That's really interesting to speak to you about this. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. Really nice to talk to you.